All right, well, we just talked about how in the early, well, not early, but by the mid 1600s, in the English colonies, the southern English colonies, that the labor was being done by white indentured servants, by African slaves who began to be imported in 1619, and by Native American Indian slaves who had either been directly captured or bought from other tribes. And then we talked about how over the course of the 17th century, that first indentured servants kind of fell by the wayside as a major labor force due to Bacon's rebellion. And then, as a result of the Yamasee War, American Indians were no longer used as slaves on those plantations, so that by about 1720 or so, it was African slaves doing most of the labor on the plantations and experiencing all of the slavery. Well, this leads to a question that historians have been asking since the 1960s, at least, and that is, which came first, slavery or racism? Hopefully, you're already aware that racism goes hand in hand with slavery, and the two developed along the same lines at the same time at the foundation of this country, as we have been discussing. But, well, it's kind of like a chicken and the egg question, but I don't know. I think that the stuff that we've discussed kind of helps us to isolate what the answer might be. So, just to reframe the question and make it a little more complex, is it because people from sub-Saharan Africa looked so differently from Europeans? Was that why they were singled out and that they wound up being the primary forced labor pool? Because they were so different, because they looked so different? Or was the fact that they wound up being the primary forced labor pool, is that what then caused racism as a way to justify and support the enslavement of those people once it became obvious that they were the ones that it was in the best interests of the plantation owners to have as slaves? And I think it is that second possibility. I think that is more likely the answer, because in the beginning, in the very beginning, in the 1620s, 1630s, in Virginia, at least, those English colonists weren't entirely sure how to treat African slaves and how differently they might be from white indentured servants. Both the white and the black workers were laboring alongside American Indian captives, and for the reasons that we just discussed, it just so happened that in the end it was black people of African descent, that wound up being the only ones who were slaves and the ones who were doing most of the work. And that because of those economic considerations, then racism developed as a way to keep them, quote, in their place, and to justify and support that way of doing things. Now, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how that works, but I want to look at a couple of things in the 1600s that kind of reinforce my opinion here, and the opinion of many historians, by the way. And that is the very concept of Europeans being white. Now, we all know that white people aren't literally white, unless maybe they're albinos. They're not white at all. They are we are kind of a pinkish hue, maybe a peach hue, not white. The fact is, Europeans were not called white before the 1600s. Now, people from sub-Saharan Africa had been called black for some time by Europeans, although not for a long time. Now, in the medieval period, the period all the way leading up to the 1400s, race didn't really exist the way we think of it today. Races meant groups of people. So you could have the English race, the French race, and the German race, who all look the same on the outside, because that whole idea of race is maybe you've heard this before, a social construct. People didn't identify by race before Columbus. They primarily identified by religion. So the really big conflict in the Western world was between Christendom and Islam. And among the Muslim world, there were lots of different kinds of people. Among the Christian world, there were lots of different kinds of people, but their religion is primarily how they identified. And that only began to change with the modern world, and the modern world was in the 1400s with the age of exploration. So, to look at how that changed, there was a book a few years ago called Buying Whiteness by an English professor named Gary Taylor. Actually, he was a specialist in Shakespeare. And what he did, this was in the early 2000s, was that he used computers, a little 21st century magic in looking at the past. He took digitized copies of everything that we now have available that was published in England in the 1600s. So that is a pretty large archive. And you can put all that in a computer and do a search. And that's exactly what he did. He searched for the descriptors of black and white as applying to people, to human beings. And what he found was that in the early 1600s, occasionally, people from Africa were referred to as black. More often they would be called Ethiopian or Moors, but sometimes they were called black. But in the early 1600s, there were virtually no instances, of Europeans being called white, not until about 1620. And as the century progressed, by the mid-1600s, there were starting to be more instances of Europeans being called white. By 1699, 1700 turn of that century, it had become commonplace to refer to Europeans as white people. So think about that for a second. In the English language, white people were not white people until after 1619, when the English started having African slaves. Now, the Spanish and Portuguese had begun referring to themselves as blanco, or white, about 100 years before that. The Spanish and the Portuguese got involved in the African slave trade well over 100 years before the English did. So once they started trading in African slaves, that's when they started calling themselves white, so as to distinguish themselves from the people they were enslaving. That's interesting. Now here's something else interesting that took place in the 1600s. In England, in portraits. Okay, so now here is a portrait of King Henry VIII, who died, I think, in 1547. So this was very typical for portraits of English people and European people in the 1500s. They had a ruddy complexion, kind of like people tend to do in real life. Okay, So this was like the mid 1500s, but early 1600s, people were painted with this kind of complexion. English people by English artists. However, as the 1600s continued on, by the end of the 1600s, portraits of English people were more likely to look like this. See this guy? A remarkably white guy. In paintings, English people were getting whiter. And by extension, also people from other European countries were getting significantly paler in their portraits. Now, in real life, they weren't really getting paler. They weren't really getting whiter. Their skin was still their skin. People still spent roughly the same amount of time in the sun, depending on their social class. But all of a sudden, by the late 1600s, particularly well-to-do English people wanted to emphasize how white they were, how white they appeared, how white they thought of themselves, not literally how white they were. So think about that, and think about the fact that this gradual change in calling people white and portraying people as white happened at the same time, in the same trajectory as the gradual development of African slavery by the English. Fascinating to think about. All right. Well, let's now take a closer look again at how slavery was working by the 1700s in the English colonies, specifically in North America. So, in the 13 colonies, there were 3 types of slavery in the 1700s. There was tobacco-based plantation slavery, which took place in the Chesapeake area, that's Virginia and Maryland, and North Carolina to an extent. Not really part of the Chesapeake area, but that's where there was a lot of tobacco. Rice-based plantation slavery, as we mentioned before, in South Carolina. That was the second kind. And even though these are both plantations with plantation owners and slave drivers and slaves, in practice, how things were done were different between those two systems, okay? Third thing is non-plantation slavery, both in the South and in the North. So let's take a closer look first at tobacco-based plantation slavery. Plantations that grew tobacco tended to be smaller than, for example, plantations in the Caribbean that grew sugar. So smaller plantations. The wealthy, the elite among the colonists got the best land in Virginia and Maryland. We talked about that. By the time those indentured servants were free and able to get land, there wasn't much good land to be had. The best land was taken by the plantation owners and was being used to grow tobacco. And by the 1750, as we saw before, in Virginia, and this is not quite as true, but almost as true in Maryland, the population was roughly 50% black in those colonies. And over time, over the course of the 1600s and especially into the 1700s, black people in the southern colonies began to slowly lose their rights. Now, this is kind of running counter to what most of you probably would have thought, what most people thought. Most people would think that being a slave in Virginia in 1650 would have been much worse than being a slave in 1750, and that would have been much worse than being a slave in 1850. You would think that gradually things got better, but that's not how it worked. It started off bad, and gradually, over time, kept getting worse and worse. So, in 1650, the mid-1600s, in Virginia and Maryland, if you were of African descent and you were free, and there was always a smaller number of free blacks, but there were a number of them. You had basically the same rights as free white people. So if you're a free black man, of course, if you're a woman, you're kind of out of luck all the way around. But if you're a free black man, you've got the same rights as a free white man. But that started to change, particularly after Bacon's Rebellion. Some of the changes that occurred were that free blacks in Virginia and then in the other colonies gradually, there were more strict laws passed regulating their behavior and their rights. It became illegal for a free black man to hire a white person. So you could be a free black guy and you could have more money than most of the people in town, but it was against the law for you to hire a white person because that was inappropriate because white people are superior to you. And again, according to the law, after Bacon's Rebellion. Actually, it started just before that and intensified after Bacon's Rebellion. Black people, free black people, lost the right to bear arms, which they had every right to do before Bacon's Rebellion, but then remember, they were involved in the rebellion. Remember also that the goal of the colonial elites after Bacon's Rebellion, to keep anything like that from ever happening again, was to keep poor white people and poor black people from working together. So by having these laws that took away the rights of black people, that made the poor white people feel like they had a special status that black people did not. Other laws that came about, if you were a free black person, it became against the law for you to strike a white person, even if they hit you first, even if you were defending yourself. Then, special taxes were levied against free black people that other people didn't have to pay. Now, why would free black people be required to pay higher taxes? To get more money out of them, yes, but mainly to make life more difficult. Why? Because if you make life difficult enough in the colony of Virginia for free black people, if you raise their taxes, for example, then maybe they'll leave. Maybe they'll move to some other colony. Finally, by 1723, free blacks in Virginia lost the right to vote. Think about that for a second, and then think about what that means. That means before 1723, free black people had the right to vote in all the English colonies. So what's happening is that gradually concepts of race are solidifying in the South and to a lesser degree in the North. And what that also means, is that race, as that is becoming the main thing to identify people, then social class is no longer being used as the main thing to identify people. It's not as important as race. And as a result, a racial hierarchy begins to form. Again, primarily in the southern colonies, but this also held true in the northern colonies where there was slavery at this time. And that brings us to this image, this pyramid that lays out the basis, essentially, of colonial society, particularly in the South. You could say colonial society. You could also say antebellum Southern society in the United States period. This image I was first introduced to when I took this very class from Larry Whitaker back around the year 2000. So it's a pyramid. You know how pyramids work, right? Pyramid schemes, all the power flows to the top. This pyramid represents the culture of the southern colonies. And again, this will apply as well, although perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, just because of population of African Americans in the north. So at the very top, you've got the wealthy elite. And in the southern colonies, that was the planter class, the people who owned the plantations. And a lot of times, pay attention as we go through this course and you'll notice this, the people in those southern colonies, even after they become southern states, the people who own plantations also tend to be the political leaders. All right, so they're at the top. Underneath them, artisans and craftsmen, what would become known by the 1830s, 1840s as the middling class. We today would refer to as the middle class. Carpenters, things like that. Below them, the next level, poor whites. Now, these folks are initially those indentured servants who came over and lived to the end of their indenture and got their freedom, but didn't really have anything else. And then as time went on, this would be the descendants of those people, and sometimes descendants of immigrants who came over after that. And we'll talk about immigration, particularly into the southern colonies later. So poor white people. And then below that, a very narrow band of free blacks. So there was never a huge number, nor a huge percentage of the black population, but a significant amount of black people were free in the colonial era. And then underneath them, and in the southern colonies, this is like in Virginia, remember 50%. In Carolina, South Carolina, it's going to wind up being like 2/3. Slaves. Slaves are the base here of this pyramid. Slaves are the foundation of this pyramid. If you were to be able to jerk out that bottom level, just pull it out, what would happen? It would all come crumbling down. And it would not be able to exist in the form it is there existing with the planters at the top. Okay? Well, this is how things were already being laid out in the 1600s in Virginia. Now, what those laws that were beginning to be passed in Virginia in the 1670s and accelerated after Bacon's Rebellion, what those laws about race did was introduce a line, a color line, right slashing through that pyramid, separating the poor whites from the free blacks. Now, this includes the laws I mentioned that slowly started to take away more and more rights from free black people that just automatically would make white people seem higher in society because now they've still got those rights and black people don't. But other things like laws that made it illegal to marry someone of another race, interracial marriage between black and white people was illegal. It wasn't illegal before, and it was pretty common in the Virginia colony, pretty common among those poor white people, either while they were still indentured servants or after they got their indenture ended. It was fairly common to have racially mixed families, but no more. In fact, those families that existed either had to live live with their rights being restricted, or in a lot of cases they moved. They left Virginia and they went further west, deeper into the mountains and established communities of their own. What does this line do? What this line does is it stabilizes the pyramid. Who wants this pyramid stable? Who benefits most from the pyramid being stable? The ones at the top. And remember, just like a financial pyramid scheme, the money and the power flow up. So what this means is that whereas during Bacon's Rebellion, poor white people and free black people and runaway slaves all came to the conclusion they've got a lot in common. They're all being treated badly by the colonial elite class, and they have a lot in common with each other, and they should band together. The purpose of these laws was to keep them from banding together, not just physically keeping them apart, but mentally introducing things that are going to make these barriers, these invisible barriers, seem real and then become real. So the people at the very top, the planter class, can tell those poor whites who are in the middle of the pyramid here, but they're at the bottom of the white part of it. They could tell the poor whites, listen, you don't have as much money as we do, and you probably never will. You don't have all the advantages that we do. You don't have the education that we do. You don't have the social collateral or clout that we do. But you're still one of us. You're on this side of the line. You're one of us. You're not one of them. At least you're better than them. That is, black people, free or slave. At least you're better than they are. And so it's us, all of us here on this side of the line, against them. And you don't want them moving up the ladder. You don't want your children having to go to school with them. You don't want to be socially mixed together with them. You don't want to be treated like them. You're better than they are. You are on our side. So you see how this would work. And just in case you don't, I'm going to give you an example that probably isn't really helping my case too much, because most of my students nowadays have no idea what this is, but some of you may. It was a TV show, a sitcom in the 1970s called All in the Family. Probably one of the best and certainly one of the most important TV sitcoms of all time. And that's because it dealt with a lot of issues that had been taboo on television before. Race, abortion, gay rights, transgender issues, all these things that couldn't even be alluded to were tackled in this show. And here's why I bring it up. If you're not familiar with the show, here's what it was about. It was set in New York City, in Queens, in the 1970s. And you've basically got this middle-aged couple. There they are in the middle. The wife, Edith, and the husband, Archie Bunker. And they have a daughter, a teenage, late teens daughter named Gloria. And she goes off to college. And while she goes off to college, she falls in with this hippie liberal college student named Michael Stivic. He is Polish American. And one of the worst things about him is he's an English major. And then he goes on over the course of the show to go to graduate school and become a professor. Dear God. Anyway, so the parents, who are middle class, middle-aged, and very conservative, are opposed, especially the dad. The mother doesn't care as much, but the dad is just absolutely opposed to everything that Michael stands for. And their daughter actually elopes and marries this guy, except they're college students and have no place to live, so they come and live with her parents, hence, All in the Family. And the whole basis of the show is basically Archie and his new son-in-law, the hippie, arguing constantly about politics and about social change. Archie Bunker is extremely prejudiced against everybody. He is prejudiced against everybody not like him, which is to say, white, Anglo-Saxon, that is of English descent, and Protestant. Now, that means that he doesn't like black people, so he really freaks out when black family moves next door and becomes supporting characters. The Jeffersons, who would get their own show later. He doesn't like black people, doesn't like Puerto Ricans, can't stand gay people, doesn't like his son-in-law, not just because he's a hippie, but because he's Polish, doesn't like Catholics, doesn't like anything that is not, like him, mainstream America. Now, Archie Bunker, the character, was a World War II veteran, a high school dropout, grew up in the Depression, dropped out of high school. He works 2 jobs. He works all day at a factory, and at night he drives a cab, and it's all he can do to scrape together enough money to have this modest house in this very modest, kind of rundown neighborhood. He is kind of at the bottom of the ladder of the American dream, but he's white. And as such, he has been able all his life to at least know he's better than all those other people. But the show takes place in the 1970s. Civil rights movement is still going on. Black power movement still going on. Gay rights is beginning. Women's liberation is beginning. All these different things, these social changes that are rocking the boat, upsetting the pyramid, see? Because he was at the very bottom of the white part of that pyramid, but he could still feel good because he was at least on the upper half. But now everything is in flux, and that's why he's mad all the time, because there's so much change. And if you stop and think about that, even if you've never heard of this show, which was on 50 years ago, you might recognize that there's still people like that. In fact, there's as many or more now as there were 50 years ago. So that is a real world, well, a fictional TV world example, but at least a 20th century example of how that pyramid, even though there's no longer any slavery, how that pyramid works. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson, when talking about the fact that so many white people in the South supported segregation, he explained it this way, quote, "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll even empty his pockets for you." Now think about that. Here's another way that I like to demonstrate how this principle works. The cookie analogy. So, back in the days when I did not record my lectures like this, but you had to actually come to class face to face, I would warn people, don't just look at the slides and not take notes or not come to class, because you'll be totally unable to explain this just from the picture. Because it is actually, this picture is an illustration of how colonial society and later antebellum Southern society worked. So, here we go. Just imagine you got a little table, and in the middle of the table is a plate full of cookies. Chocolate chip cookies in the picture. That's one of my favorites, so that's what we'll go with. There's 10 cookies on this plate. Well, 3 people sit down at this table. One is a wealthy white guy in the colonial and antebellum scenario, a plantation owner. He takes 8 cookies. Also sitting down there is a poor white guy. He gets 1 cookie. And a black guy. He gets 1 cookie. This is how the South worked from the time it was colonies through the time it became states. And I say the South, but this filtered upward, and this became how things worked in the North too, okay? Here's how it worked. The guy with 8 cookies leans over to the poor white guy with 1 cookie and says, "You better watch that black guy. I think he wants to steal your cookie." And so now the white guy is very, very carefully watching this black guy with, quite a bit of antagonistic feeling, which the black guy resents. And so they are pitted against each other, and they never notice that first guy gets their cookies too, and he has now all the cookies. But they don't notice. So that's how That's how that worked. If you will stop and think about this, you will realize, okay, that's how race works in America. That's how it still works. And this doesn't just apply to race. This could be applied in many different scenarios. We could be talking about, for example, the labor movement later on, in which you could have, anytime that you've got a group at the top that wants to make sure that they have all the power, even though they're a smaller group, pitting the people below them against one another. Okay? When you watch the news, as you follow along in this history course, and in 2020, if you haven't taken that yet, whether I'm your professor for it or not, think about this. And the more you think about it, the more it's going to make sense, and the more you're going to see it continuing to play out all around you. Well, we covered that whole tobacco-based plantation pretty thoroughly, didn't we? All the way up to the 1970s and all in the family. So maybe we better touch on the other two in not as much depth. Although, honestly, we spun way out of just the original discussion on the tobacco stuff. Anyway, rice-based slavery in South Carolina, and then later in Georgia. Georgia, you'll remember, was the 13th and final colony. The whole rice cultivation thing requires more space for the same yield and more labor, more workers for the same yield. I think I mentioned that earlier. So the plantations are going to be much larger. There's going to be fewer of them, and they're going to be larger. Because there's fewer of them, the wealth is going to be concentrated even more. And in fact, that's what's going to happen in South Carolina. It's going to have the biggest income inequality of any of the colonies. And they are run differently, in large part because it's a different kind of people. Remember, these folks who were coming, establishing these plantations in South Carolina, most of them had grown up on plantations that their parents or grandparents had owned in the Caribbean, in Barbados or the Bahamas, where slaves were treated much more harshly than they had been in Virginia or Maryland, and that's going to be carried over as well. Now, the way the work is done initially on the rice-based plantations there in South Carolina and Georgia, and the way it's being done on the tobacco plantations too at this point, is what's known as the task system. And that's going to change. It's going to change in the 1700s, by the late 1700s, from the task system to the gang system. So what does that mean? The task system means this. So let's say you are a slave. You get up to go to work in the morning, and the overseer gives you a list of things to do for the day. So you go out and do those things. The harder you work, the more quickly you can get these things done. When your list is finished, if you've worked really hard and you finish early, then the rest of that time in the day belongs to you. So you might wind up with 2 or 3 free hours to do whatever you want. So you might be able to practice on a musical instrument, which you could then maybe even make a little money hiring yourself out, your services out. Or maybe you could have your own smaller garden and you grow your own vegetables, which you could trade with other people or maybe even sell. The gang system is what gets introduced pretty quickly in South Carolina and then spreads to the other colonies. The gang system works like this. You're a slave, you get up in the morning, you report with all the other slaves to the overseer, the overseers, and they just make sure you keep working for the master from sunup to sundown. And if you finish one thing, they find something else for you to do. And what that means is you no longer have any free time. You've lost some of that freedom, both just to breathe a little bit, but also to have opportunities to improve your lot. Those are slowly taken away. So life is harder. Life is harder in these rice-based plantations. Now, there's not cotton plantations, really, at this time in the 1700s. There's a handful, but not many. We'll talk about this later. Cotton at that time was not economically feasible to grow, and that will be the case until the cotton gin is invented at the end of the century. All right, well, now let's take a look at non-plantation slavery. You saw this in the southern colonies, but also this is what you saw in the other colonies in the north. That is New England and what were called the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, Delaware was considered southern. And when the colonies became states, Delaware was a slave state. All right. So if you're not working on a plantation, what are you doing? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's just look at population. We've already talked about the fact that 3% of the population of New England by 1750 was black. Some of those were free black people, and some of them were slaves. 3%. We also talked about how New York City was 20% black. The colony of New York overall was 10%, and so was New Jersey. The really big slave market in the North was the one established on Wall Street in 1709. I remember when I was in grad school, back around 2005 or so, they were excavating a destroyed building in downtown Manhattan to put up the foundations for a new building, and they found hundreds of skeletons in there. It turns out that had been just a huge unmarked graveyard for dead slaves in the 1700s. All right, so what would you be doing if you were a slave, let's say in New England, like Boston? Well, you're not working on a plantation. They don't have plantations, but they do have farms. They do not yet in the 1700s have huge commercial farms, at least not very many, nothing that really approaches that. So just kind of privately owned farms. You might belong to a person who owns a farm in Pennsylvania, let's say. Or in New Jersey, so you'll be working on that farm. Or maybe you belong to a carpenter, and so you work in his shop, doing whatever he has you do. Or sometimes in mines. That was a place that slaves were often used. Or, and this is true in New York City, and this is why there were so many slaves in New York, other than the fact that the big slave market was there. New York was the biggest port of the colonies. And lots of slaves were used as stevedores or dock workers, loading and unloading the ships. However, most likely thing that you'd be doing if you were a slave in the North is that you would be a house servant. And of course in the South they had all these things happened in the South too, but there was also plantation slavery, which is what most slaves did. So, house servants. In the 13 colonies, 75% of wealthy families that lived in cities, north or south, owned at least one slave, sometimes more. So, wealthy families in Boston, wealthy families in New York City, wealthy families throughout those larger cities in the north would have a maid, perhaps, or a butler, or cooks, or nannies who were slaves that they owned. Now, in those northern colonies, laws regarding the treatment of slaves and laws regarding the rights of free black people were never as harsh as they were in the southern colonies. And that's because there were never as many slaves, right? So New York City was the place with the largest number of slaves in the north, 20%. But outside there, you're talking 5-10% of the population at most in any of these colonies. That meant there weren't enough of them to scare the white people who were in the majority, and that was not true in the South. Every time, as we will see, every time there's a slave rebellion or attempted uprising in the South, that's really scary to the white slave-owning families and even people who don't own slaves that are white. So every time that happens, the laws get stricter. And that didn't happen in the North. Now, gradually, slavery decreased in the North. So we're looking at the numbers from 1750. By the beginning of the American Revolution, 1776, there was still slavery in all 13 colonies, even Massachusetts. Slavery still existed, but there were fewer slaves, many, many fewer than there had been just a quarter of a century earlier. Slavery was kind of being phased out in the North. Now, you might think that's because people were so progressive and forward-looking and humanitarian in the North compared to the South. But that's not the reason. Primarily the reason was economic. In the 1700s, the economy was very unstable. It fluctuated a lot. There were a lot of financial panics. The economy, the bottom could fall out of it at any time. You'd have one or two good years, then everything could fall apart for a while. And you never knew. Very unstable. So those people, those artisans and craftsmen, like the theoretical cabinet maker or carpenter that I talked about before, who might have invested in buying a slave or two to work in their shop, when the economy would go south, when the economy failed, they were in a bad way because they're losing money. They're losing money. The economy's bad. But they still have to feed these slaves. They still have to provide them with housing. Well, you could say if the economy's bad and you're doing bad personally in your business, you could just sell your slaves, but the problem is the economy's bad, so no one wants to invest in them. And if you sell them at all, you'll get a terrible price. So you're going to be losing money. Either way, you're losing money. If you sell them, you're losing money because you're not getting what you paid for them. If you keep them, you're losing money because you're having to provide for them, even though you're not doing well yourself. And more people in the cities in the North who had been investing in slaves, more and more they came to the conclusion that if instead they used free labor, that is to say, if they hired people instead of bought people, when the economy was bad, they could just fire all of them and leave them out on their own and not have to be responsible for them anymore. And when the economy started to pick back up and they needed workers again, they could just hire more, and it would be easy to get them because they've been out of work. And that is a lot more economically feasible than investing in slaves. And so that's why by the 1770s, slavery was practically, it still existed, but it was definitely on its way out. And a lot of people thought in the South that the same thing was going to happen, but it didn't quite turn out that way.